turning and turning in the widening gyre. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born? William Yeats' poem The Second Coming was composed in January 1919, in the wake of the First World War, the Russian Revolution, and the political turmoil in his native island. As Mick Tabor observes, however, the first stanza captures more than just political unrest and violence. Its anxiety concerns the social ills of modernity, the rupture of traditional family and societal structures, the loss of collective religious faith, and with it the collective sense of purpose, the feeling that the old rules no longer apply and there's nothing to replace them. This sense of dread cannot be overstated. In the form of this slouching beast, the narrator of Yeats' poem accurately foretells that something is happening, that something yet more remarkable than what he describes as mere anarchy is about to take place, that something beyond the categories of our understanding is entering into the world. As the poem forebodes, 20th century history did turn more horrific after 1919, and in ways that radically undermined the foundations of our political, scientific, and indeed ethical outlooks. A century after the poem was written, this beast may be best understood not as a particular political regime, or even fascism itself, but a broader historical force comprising the technological, the ideological, and the political. The beast can be seen, in other words, as the Holocaust, the regimes of Stalin and Mao, and of special significance here, the atomic bomb. Causing the deaths of hundreds of thousands and inspiring a half-century of paranoia and madness, the invention of Robert Oppenheimer can't be disentangled from this broader context of nihilism and disorder. Nor can a particular accomplishment, which in a sense to be explained, merely actualized the horror of this breakdown itself. On September 1, 1939, the same day the Nazi tanks crossed the Polish frontier, Robert Oppenheimer and Hartland Snyder published an article in Volume 56 of the Physical Review. In it, the two physicists from North America demonstrated beyond all shadow of a doubt that when all thermonuclear sources of energy are exhausted, a sufficiently heavy star will collapse, unless it reduces its mass due to fission, rotation, or radiation. This contraction will continue indefinitely, forming an entity that is capable of crumpling space like a piece of paper and extinguishing time like a blown-out candle, and that no natural wall of physical force could avert. Oppenheimer's accomplishment at the beginning of the Second World War is not of discovery, but as Benjamin Labatut's novel When You Cease to Understand the World attempts to suggest, is one of complementation, not simply of particular scientific concepts, but of a new paradigm, in which an inescapable abyss cut off from the rest of the universe could exist, constituting the first exact solution to the equations of general relativity. The calculations of Karl Schwarzschild agreed with the predictions of Albert Einstein, up until the point to which mass was concentrated in a very small area, as occurs when the giant star exhausts its fuel and begins to collapse. In such a case, space-time would not simply bend, it would tear apart. The star would go on compressing, and its density would increase till the force of gravity became so powerful that space had become infinitely curved, closing in on itself. Here the equations of general relativity went mad. Time froze, space coiled around itself like a serpent. At the center of that dying star, all mass became concentrated in a single point with infinite density. For Schwarzschild, that such a thing could exist in the universe was inconceivable. Not only did it defy common sense and cast doubts on general relativity, it threatened the very foundations of physics. As within the singularity, the notions of space and time themselves became meaningless. The anomalies were not confined to the singularity's interior. Around it there existed a limit, a barrier that marked a point of no return. After crossing that line, any object, from a whole planet to a minuscule subatomic particle, would be trapped forever. It would disappear from the universe as though it had fallen into a bottomless pit. According to Schwarzschild, the most frightful thing about mass at its most extreme degree of concentration was not the way it altered the form of space, or the strange effects it exerted on time. The true horror, he said, was that the singularity was a blind spot, fundamentally unknowable. Light could never escape from it, so our eyes were incapable of seeing it, nor could our minds grasp it, because at the singularity the worlds of general relativity simply broke down, and thus physics no longer had any meaning. Einstein's rejection of this entity, and by extension the universe Schwarzschild glimpsed, might thus be understood as an attempt to recover not only the rent in the fabric of space-time, but also the possibility of a knowable universe. It is here Oppenheimer's confirmation of the horror envisioned by Schwarzschild becomes a repudiation of which is Einstein's position against the chaos posed by this singularity, but order itself. Against this backdrop, Oppenheimer isn't a leading figure, but an affirmation of a darker, nightmarish vision inaugurated by the thinkers that presaged him. He is, in other words, a figure of what Labatut situates as the apocalyptic imagination of Schwarzschild, Werner Heisenberg, and Niels Bohr, at least as their work appears to all those who had put their faith in the clockwork universe Newtonian physics had promised. That is, to enthrone a cosmology in which, far from being presided over by a rational God pulling the threads of the world, there is instead nothing more than lifeless spheres in the throes of random chance. Or indeed, to draw on Oppenheimer's interest in Hindu mythology, the whims of a many-armed goddess toying with chance. Countless men in the room with slanted eyes, their bodies sculpted of soot and ash, were stretching out their arms to try and touch him. They thrummed around him without managing to advance, humming like a cluster of bees caught in the threads of an invisible web. Heisenberg tried to take the hand of a baby that had broken through the net and was crawling towards him, but an explosion pulverized the figures and brought him to his knees. Rummaging in the dirt to try and salvage some trace, some vestige of those phantoms. To his master Bohr, he thought he could speak about anything, but alone together he found himself incapable of confessing his vision of the dead baby at his feet, or the thousands of figures who had surrounded him in the forest, as if wishing to warn him of something, before they were carbonized in an instant by that flash of blind light. In Christopher Nolan's film, Oppenheimer is made to speak in front of the many workers and scientists in the makeshift lecture hall in Los Alamos. They are in a frenzy. The successful bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki has stirred them into a patriotic fervor. They are hungry for him to affirm their achievement. They are hungry for him to proclaim himself, death, the destroyer of worlds. As he begins to speak, Oppenheimer is assailed by a vision of blinding light that registers not only a profound sense of guilt, but recalling his characterization of the atomic bomb as a sin, the way in which this guilt has transformed his sense of place in the world. He sees the blood on his hands. He sees the blood on all those who helped him. Every man and woman. It is washed over all of them. What is implicit here is the idea that to now be a scientist, that is to contribute to scientific discovery, is to not only participate in this bloodshed, but also to further the limits of what human beings can do, of the atrocities it can commit, suggesting that this blinding light may also be understood as a kind of ethical awakening, or indeed as a moment of profound maturity that was previously lacking. In Labatut's novel, the vision of light that assails Oppenheimer in the wake of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is given to Heisenberg with the completion of his uncertainty principle, and with it the inauguration of a science that can no longer speak of the real, and in which scientists are not objective, detached observers, but actors in a game between man and the world. While they may rightly speculate as to the truth of Heisenberg's preternatural powers, that is, his capacity to see in 1927 the creation of the atomic bomb, Labatut sensed that Heisenberg was aware, however dimly, of the implications of his accomplishment, of his important insight into the question of why he didn't create an atomic bomb himself, or more precisely of why, despite being involved in the German nuclear weapons program, he had never attempted to, or indeed had never even conceived of one. Of the creation of the atomic bomb, John von Neumann, as Labatut compiles in the Maniac, said that we are all little children with respect to the situation which had developed, namely that we suddenly were doing the something with which we could blow up the world. Neumann's passivity in relation to the development of the bomb, which he, alongside Oppenheimer and the team of scientists at Los Alamos, actively created, is exemplary of this childishness, and what may it be understood as the failure to really come to terms with the significance of what exactly they were doing. In his famous address of the subject, Oppenheimer touches on this point as he invokes the idea of duty as a means of circumscribing what appears as his childish lack of understanding in relation to the situation which had developed, and explicitly draws upon the scripture of the Bhagavad Gita as a way of reimagining the service of scientists in its wake. Vishnu, Oppenheimer recalls, is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to depress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose you all thought that, one way or another. In the language available to those unfamiliar with Hindu scripture, the thought that Oppenheimer recognizes in his fellows is the idea they had become something for which they must now answer, signaling in the form of the petitions that now began circulating, the beginnings of a project to go back, to undo what they thus feel to have set into motion, the rough beast slouching towards Bethlehem to be born. The problem, as Labatut voices to the figure of Richard Feynman, is that the bombs we created were in the hands of the military, and they were going to use them no matter what, which not only implicates the naivety of the scientists themselves and their commitment to what was always a militaristic project, but the naivety of scientific curiosity itself. The desire to know, to calculate, to see what human beings are capable of, is not innocent, but faithful to the lack of knowledge that animates the quest for discovery, is ignorant of the simple wisdom that we already know better, that human beings are already capable of anything. This is to say that the desire for knowledge is not amoral, but a repudiation of morality, of the laws that could only constrain us in our childish desire to see. It is, in other words, a rejection of maturity, as it is embodied in the form of tradition, wisdom, and indeed common sense of the kind that would deny as absurd the Copernican revolution upon which the clockwork unit universe of Newtonian physics is premised. That is, the idea that the sun, not the earth, is at the center of the solar system. That as we rest in the shade of the tree and wake up in the blazing light, we, and not the sun, have moved. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The heat dissipated and the light was gone. I heard people cheering and clapping and laughing. So many people celebrating and screaming with joy. Some of us were quiet. Some were even praying as they looked up at the ominous mushroom cloud hanging over us, with all of the radioactivity glowing purplish and alien inside it, rising higher and higher into the stratosphere while the terrifying thunder from the blast kept echoing back and forth, over and over again, bouncing along the mountains like the bell tolling for the end of the world. As though finally aware of the consequences of their actions, Oppenheimer's regret, as well as the various petitions of the completion of the atomic bomb inspired, suddenly seemed to lack any real authority, appearing instead like the contrition of children who have gone too far, who, sparing the boundary laid out for them, long to go home, to what, in the case of these scientists, may be understood as the realm of common sense, of tradition, of what is, in the end, unscientific. As no one so powerfully depicts, Oppenheimer's humiliation at the hands of President Truman is exemplary of this position. As he feebly attempts to articulate his sense of culpability, as well as his plea to abort the arms race he made possible, Truman's stature seems to go to that of the stern headmaster as he dismisses Oppenheimer's lame, self-indulgent agony, and the way that debases the father of the atomic bomb father assumes full responsibility for all the death and destruction caused by his creation. You think anyone in Hiroshima or Nagasaki cares who built the bomb? They care who dropped it, Truman avers, and as though he could not care less as to whether or not Oppenheimer could hear him, states to his aide, "Don't let that crybaby back in here." Oppenheimer's lack of moral standing registers the belatedness of his concern for the bomb as a weapon of mass destruction, or to put this another way, of the significance of his work in relation to the real world itself, which it seemed was always abstract to his calculations, even as they indicated the possibility that not thousands but billions of people could die. While remote, perhaps even negligible, the not zero chance that the atomic bomb could have ended human life on this planet calls to mind the fact that long before Truman deployed these weapons, Oppenheimer and his team of scientists were already forced to consider the possibility that they could annihilate all human life, and more importantly, that they had thus chose to recall the world to Albert Einstein, to play dice with the universe, and were therefore willing, as if it were natural to the course of things, as if it were not even something to consider, to play God. Influenced by the clamor of the May 68 protests all around him, mathematician Alexander Grothendieck called on more than 100 students during the masterclass at the University of Paris in Orsay to renounce the vile and dangerous practice of mathematics in light of the hazards humanity was facing. It was not politicians who destroyed the planet, he told them, but scientists like them who are marching like sleepwalkers towards the apocalypse. During his talks, he gave away apples and figs grown in his garden, and warned about the destructive power of science. The atoms that tore Hiroshima and Nagasaki apart were split not by the greasy fingers of a general, but by a group of physicists armed with a fistful of equations. Grothendieck could not stop fretting over the possible effects that his own ideas could have on the world. What new horrors would spring forth from the total comprehension that he sought? What would mankind do if it could reach the heart of the heart? As they are animated by their desire to know, the scientist appears as not a rational designer, but as like the multi-armed Kali, who are not game with the universe, toys with chance as though it lacks real existence. At the close of Nolan's Oppenheimer, the focus turns to a conversation that for Einstein becomes a source of serious reflection. "Remember, Albert, when I came to see you with those calculations, We thought we might start a chain reaction that would destroy the entire world. I believe we did. The magnitude of this moment is diminished by the rather simple thought that yes, of course, the creation of an atomic bomb could threaten to destroy the world. To the civil protesters, to the military institution, to any person of common sense, this point was always clear. Indeed, this power was precisely what the protesters feared and was exactly what the military hoped for. And yet, as though this was something neither he nor Einstein considered, that is, the practical implications of what he accomplished. This thought strikes him as something not only new, but profound, highlighting that the scientists, at least as they appear in these mediums, have always been removed from the real world, even as they claim to hold the truth of it. In the form of his ignorance, what has truly threatened life as we know it is not Oppenheimer himself, but his scientific spirit, which connects him as one link in a great chain of thinkers, who, overstepping the bounds of common sense and reason, have introduced one further insight into the question into what human beings are capable of. Of these recent depictions of scientists in the work of Labatut and Nolan, what is perhaps most interesting is the underlying ethics of science as it appears in the form of a blinding commitment to not this world, but as the world of common sense, but the possible worlds they glimpse before them, which, as the atomic bomb dramatizes, is prior to any such consideration of morality or politics, and as Heisenberg's example perhaps suggests, they only be tamed by the recognition that I am what I am.